Vex 9 had seen many things during his 47 cycles as a diplomatic security officer. He had witnessed the Thraxian ambassador accidentally consume his own bodyguard, mistaking him for a ceremonial snack. He had observed the Krillic delegation attempt to negotiate a peace treaty while literally eating the furniture. Hell, he had even survived the infamous Great Misunderstanding of Sector 7, where a single mispronounced greeting had resulted in 3 species declaring war on their own shadows. But this was different. This was terrifying. The human sat in the corner of the diplomatic lounge, completely motionless except for the occasional lift of a delicate porcelain cup to her lips. Her name was Emma Rodriguez Thorne, according to the manifest, and she represented something called Earth's Colonial Mining Consortium. The other delegates had been giving her a wide berth all morning, which was probably wise, considering the stories. "Vex," whispered Torim Ka, his Zilithian partner, all 4 of his eye stalks fixed on the human. "Is it true what they say about their planet?" "Which part?" Vex replied, adjusting his ceremonial sash nervously. "The part where their sky occasionally catches fire. The part where the ground randomly opens up and swallows entire cities. Or the part where they somehow evolved on a world where literally everything, including the plants, actively tries to kill them. All of it." "Unfortunately, yes." Emma took another sip of her tea, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth as if she had heard every word. Which, knowing humans, she probably had. Their hearing was absurdly good for creatures who had supposedly evolved in an environment where being quiet was the difference between life and becoming something else's lunch. The diplomatic station Harmony 7 was supposed to be neutral ground, a place where all species could meet safely to discuss trade agreements, territorial disputes, and the occasional intergalactic incident involving accidentally time-traveling into someone else's birthday party. The station's design reflected this neutrality: soft curves, calming blue lights, and furniture that could accommodate everything from the gas-based ethereals to the rock-solid granite lords. Emma looked perfectly comfortable in her chair, which was remarkable considering it had been designed for beings with 3 times her mass and significantly fewer bones. She had somehow arranged herself in a position that looked both relaxed and ready to spring into action at any moment. It was like watching a predator pretend to nap. "She has been sitting there for 2 hours," observed Clix Prime, the station's head of security. His chitinous shell was a nervous shade of purple today. "Drinking that same cup of tea. I have had my sensors trained on her the entire time. The liquid level in that cup has not decreased by more than 15 milliliters. Maybe she sips very slowly," suggested Torim Ka, though he did not sound convinced. "Or maybe," said Vex grimly, "she does not need to drink as much as the rest of us because her species evolved on a world where every drop of water had to be earned through mortal combat." This was not entirely true, but Vex had read the reports. Earth was what the Galactic Council politely termed a Class 12 death world, which was their way of saying it was so hostile to life that it should not technically be able to support anything more complex than particularly aggressive bacteria. Yet somehow, not only had humans survived, they had thrived. They had built cities, developed technology, and eventually made it to the stars, all while living on a planet that regularly threw continent-sized tantrums. The morning's proceedings had been going well until the hegemony delegation arrived. The Vorthan hegemony was not technically banned from Harmony 7, but they were what galactic diplomats called aggressively problematic. They had a tendency to view negotiations as a formality before the inevitable conquest, and they had brought enough weaponry to outfit a small invasion force. Commander Thrak Voss, the hegemony's lead negotiator, was a particularly unpleasant specimen. Standing nearly 3 meters tall with arms like industrial machinery and a face that looked like it had been carved from a mountainside by someone who was very angry at mountains. He had spent the last hour making increasingly loud statements about human weakness and the inevitable superiority of Vorthan military might. Emma had not responded to any of it. She had simply continued sipping her tea, occasionally nodding as if she found his threats mildly entertaining. "The little Deathworlder thinks she is safe here," Thrak announced loudly enough for the entire lounge to hear. "Protected by station treaties and diplomatic immunity. But treaties are just words, and words mean nothing when backed by insufficient force. He is going to do something stupid," Torimka whispered to Vex. "Undoubtedly," Vex agreed. "The question is whether we will survive to file the incident report." As if on cue, 12 Vorthan soldiers materialized from their cloaking devices, surrounding Emma's table with military precision. They were armed with enough firepower to level a small building, and their faces bore the kind of expression that suggested they had been looking forward to this moment for quite some time. Emma looked up from her tea for the first time in 2 hours, her eyebrows raised in what could charitably be described as mild interest. "Well," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent lounge, "this is new." Thrak stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over her table. "Human, you will come with us. Your government's refusal to acknowledge Vorthan territorial claims has become a problem that requires a more direct solution." "Has it now?" Emma asked, taking another delicate sip of tea. "How fascinating. You will be held as a diplomatic hostage until your species agrees to our terms." "And what terms would those be?" "Complete surrender of all human colonies in the Outer Rim, payment of tribute equal to 17% of your gross planetary product, and the immediate cessation of all human expansion into what we consider our rightful territory." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "So basically everything. You understand quickly for a Deathworlder." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "The question is whether you understand what you are asking." Thrak laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. "What I understand is that you are one small human surrounded by 12 of my finest soldiers, on a station where help is at least 6 hours away. What could you possibly do?" Emma smiled then, and Vex felt his secondary heart skip a beat. It was not a nice smile. It was the kind of smile that sharks probably wore right before they bit something important in half. "Well," she said conversationally, "I suppose I could finish my tea first." She lifted the cup again, and Vex noticed that her hand was completely steady. Not the artificial steadiness of someone trying very hard to appear calm, but the natural steadiness of someone who genuinely was not concerned about being surrounded by armed hostiles. It was the kind of steadiness that came from growing up on a world where being nervous got you eaten. "You think this is amusing?" Thrak snarled. "A little bit, yes," Emma admitted, "though I am curious about one thing." "What?" "Did you actually research human biology before you decided to threaten one of us?" "What does that matter?" Emma took another sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "Well, it matters because if you had done your research, you would know that humans do not actually come from what most species consider a habitable world. We come from what most species consider a barely contained apocalypse that somehow achieved sentience. Meaningless boasts." "Are they?" she asked. "Tell me, Commander, what is the gravity on your homeworld?" "Twice standard galactic measurement." She said, nodding as if this confirmed something. "And the atmospheric pressure?" 1.4 standard. "Interesting." She paused for another sip. "The gravity on Earth is nearly 3 times galactic standard. The atmospheric pressure varies wildly depending on altitude, weather patterns, and whether or not the planet is currently trying to kill everything on its surface through natural disasters. Which I should mention it does regularly." Thrak was beginning to look less confident. "Your point?" "My point is that you and your soldiers are operating in an environment that is, for you, probably quite comfortable. Low gravity, stable atmosphere, controlled temperature." She gestured around the lounge with her free hand. "For me, this is like being in a relaxation chamber. I am literally operating at about 30% of my normal capacity right now, and I am still not particularly concerned about your threats." 12 soldiers, Thrak growled, armed and trained. "Yes, I can see that," Emma said patiently. But you see, that brings me back to my original question about research. If you had done your homework, you would know that human combat training does not take place in nice, controlled environments like this one. It takes place on Earth, where the weather can kill you, the animals can kill you. The plants can kill you, and sometimes the ground itself develops opinions about your continued existence. She paused for what Vex was beginning to realize might be the most terrifying sip of tea in galactic history. "Do you know what we call combat training on Earth?" she asked conversationally. "What?" "A relaxing afternoon." That was when things got interesting. The first soldier moved faster than Vex would have thought possible for something wearing that much armor. His plasma rifle was aimed directly at Emma's center mass, and his finger was already tightening on the trigger when she moved. Vex would later struggle to describe exactly what happened next. Security footage would show that Emma simply stood up, stepped slightly to her left, and somehow the soldier's weapon was no longer in his hands. Instead, it was in hers, and he was on the floor, making sounds that suggested he was reconsidering several life choices. The truly remarkable part was that she never put down her teacup. "One," she said calmly, as if she were counting something mildly interesting rather than incapacitated hostiles. The second soldier had clearly been paying attention because he tried a different approach. Instead of trying to shoot her, he attempted to grab her with his massive armored gauntlets. This turned out to be an even worse idea than the first soldier's plan. Emma stepped backward, pivoted on one foot, and somehow used the soldier's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby pillar with enough force to crack the reinforced ceramisteel. The plasma rifle that had been in her left hand was now secured to her back with what appeared to be the soldier's own equipment harness, and she still had not spilled a single drop of tea. "Two," she announced. Vex noticed that her voice had not changed at all. She sounded like someone commenting on the weather, not someone who had just disarmed two heavily armed soldiers in approximately 4 seconds. The remaining 10 soldiers looked at each other, then at their unconscious comrades, then at the small human woman who was calmly taking another sip of tea while wearing military equipment that had not been in her possession moments earlier. "Perhaps," suggested soldier number 3, "we should reconsider our approach." "Perhaps," agreed Emma, "you should, though I admit I am curious to see how this plays out." Thrak Voss, to his credit, did not back down. "You are fast for a human," he admitted. "But you cannot fight all of us at once." "Can't I?" Emma asked, tilting her head slightly. "That is an interesting assumption. Tell me, have you ever heard of something called adrenaline?" "No." "How about fight or flight response?" "What about it?" "Well, it is this fascinating chemical reaction that humans developed as a survival mechanism. When we perceive a threat, our bodies release certain hormones that temporarily increase our strength, speed, and reaction time by significant factors." She took another sip of tea, and Vex noticed that several of the remaining soldiers were beginning to look nervous. "The interesting thing," Emma continued, "is that this response was calibrated for survival on Earth, which means it was designed to help us fight things that could actually threaten us on a Class 12 death world. Things like predators with titanium-equivalent bones, natural disasters that move faster than most species can think, and environmental hazards that make your military equipment look like children's toys." Soldier number 4 raised his weapon, and Emma sighed. "I really hoped we could resolve this diplomatically," she said, sounding genuinely disappointed. Then she moved, and Vex finally understood why humans had a reputation that extended across half the galaxy, despite being one of the newest species to achieve interstellar travel. She was fast. Not just quick, but actually measurably, impossibly fast. The security cameras, designed to track objects moving at combat speeds, registered her as a blur of motion that seemed to be in several places simultaneously. Soldiers 3 and 4 went down in what appeared to be a single motion, though detailed analysis would later show that Emma had actually performed 17 separate combat techniques in the space of 2.3 seconds. Their weapons were disassembled, their armor was strategically compromised, and they were unconscious before they hit the floor. 3 and 4, she said, pausing to adjust her grip on the teacup. The remaining 8 soldiers opened fire simultaneously, filling the air with enough plasma energy to melt through a battleship's armor plating. Emma was no longer where the shots had been aimed. She was somehow behind soldier number 5, relieving him of his weapon and his consciousness with movements that looked almost choreographed. 5, she noted, spinning the acquired rifle around her finger before tossing it aside like a discarded toy. Soldiers 6 and 7 tried to coordinate their attack, approaching from opposite sides while 8 and 9 provided covering fire. It was a textbook maneuver that should have been impossible for a single opponent to counter. Emma countered it by apparently defying several laws of physics. She vaulted over Soldier 6, used Soldier 7 as a springboard to reach Soldier 8, disarmed Soldier 9 while still airborne, and landed in a crouch that somehow resulted in all 4 of them being unconscious and weaponless. She had also, Vex noticed with growing amazement, managed to keep her tea at the perfect drinking temperature throughout the entire sequence. 6, 7, 8 and 9, she announced, standing up and brushing an imaginary speck of dust from her sleeve. Soldier 10 made the mistake of trying to retreat. Emma caught up with him in 3 steps that covered approximately 12 meters of distance, gently tapped him on the shoulder, and he collapsed like a deflated balloon. 10, she said, walking back toward her table. Soldiers 11 and 12 looked at their unconscious comrades, at the small human woman who was approaching them with a teacup in one hand and an expression of polite interest, and at each other. "We surrender," said Soldier 11. "Excellent choice," Emma replied. "If you would be so kind as to remove your weapons and place them on the floor, I promise not to render you unconscious like your friends." They complied with remarkable speed. 11 and 12, she said with satisfaction, settling back into her chair and taking another sip of tea. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes. Thrak Voss stared at his unconscious soldiers, then at Emma, who was calmly enjoying her beverage as if nothing unusual had happened. "That was," he said slowly, "unexpected." "Was it?" Emma asked. "I thought I was being fairly predictable." "You threatened me with force," I responded with superior force. "It is a fairly standard diplomatic protocol." "That was not diplomacy. That was combat. On Earth we call that aggressive negotiations." She paused thoughtfully, though I admit this was more restrained than usual. "I did not actually hurt anyone permanently, and I managed not to spill my tea. On my homeworld, that would be considered showing remarkable restraint." Vex realized that his mouth had been hanging open for some time and made a conscious effort to close it. Around the lounge, other delegates were staring in various states of shock, awe, and what appeared to be religious awakening. "Now then," Emma said, addressing Thrak Voss with the same polite tone she might use to discuss lunch plans, "I believe you mentioned something about territorial negotiations." Thrak Voss looked like someone who had just watched his entire understanding of the universe get folded into origami and set on fire. His massive frame seemed somehow smaller now, as if the very concept of intimidation had abandoned him entirely. He began, then stopped, apparently realizing that most of his vocabulary had been designed for situations where he was the one doing the threatening. Emma waited patiently, sipping her tea with the same serene expression she had worn throughout the entire incident. Vex noticed that the liquid level in her cup had barely changed despite the fact that she had been drinking from it for nearly 3 hours. Either human metabolism was even more efficient than the report suggested, or she was somehow recycling her beverages through sheer force of will. "You said something about tribute," Emma prompted gently. 17% of gross planetary product, I believe. That was, Thrak Voss glanced at his unconscious soldiers, then back at her. "That may have been an opening negotiation position." "Ah," she said, nodding as if this made perfect sense. "And what would be your closing position?" The Vorthan commander looked around the lounge desperately, as if hoping someone would provide him with a script for this situation. Unfortunately for him, most of the other delegates appeared to be in various states of shock, and several were taking notes with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious experiences. Perhaps, he said carefully, we could discuss a more mutually beneficial arrangement. How refreshing, Emma replied. I do so prefer mutually beneficial arrangements to hostile takeovers. They are much less messy, and they rarely result in people being unconscious on the floor. Clicks Prime, the station's security chief, finally found his voice. Should I have medical teams respond to the unconscious soldiers? Emma glanced over at the scattered Vorthans with the casual interest of someone checking the weather. Oh, they will be fine. I was very careful not to cause any permanent damage. They should wake up in about 15 minutes with nothing worse than bruised egos and a new perspective on human capabilities. You could have killed them, Thrak Voss said, and there was something like awe in his voice. Of course I could have, Emma replied, sounding slightly puzzled by the observation. But that would have been terribly rude. We are in a diplomatic facility, after all. There are protocols. Vex felt compelled to point out the obvious flaw in this reasoning. You just single-handedly defeated 12 armed soldiers without spilling your tea. Yes, but I defeated them politely, Emma said, as if this distinction was crucial. I did not mock them, I did not cause unnecessary pain, and I made sure to count so everyone could follow along. On Earth, that would be considered exemplary diplomatic behavior. What would be considered normal behavior? Asked Torim Ka, his eye stalks trembling slightly. Emma considered this question with the serious attention it deserved. Well, normally there would be significantly more property damage, and possibly some creative use of improvised weapons. I once saw my colleague Marcus end a bar fight using nothing but a cocktail napkin and some very aggressive origami techniques. The delegates exchanged glances that suggested they were collectively reassessing their understanding of human social customs. But enough about Earth etiquette, Emma continued briskly. Commander Thrak Voss, you came here with what I assume was a carefully planned strategy for intimidating the human delegation into submission. That strategy appears to have encountered some unexpected variables. Would you like to try a different approach? Or shall we proceed directly to the part where you explain what your people actually want? Thrak Voss straightened his shoulders, and Vex gave him credit for attempting to salvage some dignity from the situation. The Vorthan hegemony has legitimate territorial claims in the Outer Rim. Human expansion into those regions threatens our strategic interests. Which regions specifically? Emma asked, pulling out a small data pad with movements that made several nearby delegates flinch involuntarily. The Kepler 442 system, the Wolf 359 corridor, and the entire Tau Ceti trade route. Emma's eyebrows rose slightly. Those are some very specific claims. Do you have documentation supporting your territorial rights to those areas? We have been operating in those regions for over 2 centuries. Operating how? Trade routes, mining operations, defensive patrols. Interesting. Emma made a few notes on her pad. And you established these operations through formal agreements with the local governments. Thrak Voss hesitated. The regions were largely uninhabited when we arrived. Largely uninhabited or completely uninhabited. There may have been some minor indigenous populations, and you negotiated settlement agreements with these populations. We established security protocols to ensure safe operations. Emma nodded slowly, and Vex recognized the expression that was forming on her face. It was the same look she had worn right before she had systematically dismantled 12 armed soldiers. It was not a good sign for Thrak Voss, so to clarify. She said with dangerous politeness, your territorial claims are based on the fact that you moved into regions inhabited by other species, to establish military control without formal agreements, and have been extracting resources for 2 centuries without paying any compensation to the original inhabitants. When you put it like that. How else would I put it? We provided security and infrastructure development. Did the indigenous populations request security and infrastructure development? They were not in a position to make such requests. Because Because we had already established security protocols. Emma set down her teacup with a soft click that somehow managed to sound ominous. Commander, I am beginning to think that your definition of territorial claims and my definition of territorial claims might be significantly different. Our operations have been conducted according to Vorthan law. Ah, she said, brightening slightly. That is much clearer. You are operating under Vorthan law in regions that are not under Vorthan jurisdiction, extracting resources from territories that belong to other species. And you are concerned that human expansion might interfere with these activities. That is a very simplified interpretation. Is it incorrect? Thrak Voss opened his mouth, then closed it again. Around the lounge, Vex noticed that several delegates were recording the conversation with expressions that suggested they were witnessing something historically significant. I think I understand the situation now, Emma continued. You are concerned that humans might do to you what you have been doing to everyone else. That is not what I said. It is what you described, though. She picked up her teacup again and took a delicate sip. The good news is that humans generally do not operate that way. We prefer to establish formal agreements with legitimate governments, pay fair compensation for resources, and respect existing territorial boundaries. Then why are you expanding so aggressively? Because we need places to live, Emma said simply. Earth is a wonderful planet, but it has some space limitations. We have approximately 8 billion people who would like to continue existing, and many of them would prefer to do so somewhere with less gravity and fewer natural disasters. She paused thoughtfully. Also, we have discovered that we rather enjoy meeting new species and learning about different cultures. It turns out that growing up on a Deathworld gives you a unique appreciation for places where the weather is not actively trying to kill you. And if your expansion conflicts with our interests. Emma smiled again, and Vex felt his secondary heart skip another beat. Well, that depends entirely on what your interests actually are. If your interests involve continuing to extract resources from territories that do not belong to you without compensation or consent, then yes, our expansion might conflict with those interests. We tend to have opinions about that sort of behavior. What kind of opinions? The kind that result in people lying unconscious on diplomatic station floors. Thrak Voss glanced at his scattered soldiers again. You said they would wake up in 15 minutes. I did. And when they do, they will have learned something valuable about the consequences of threatening humans in diplomatic venues. Consider it an educational experience. As if on cue, soldier number 1 groaned and attempted to sit up. He took one look at Emma, who waved cheerfully, and decided that remaining unconscious might be the better option. Actually, Emma said, consulting her datapad, I have a counter-proposal for you, Commander. What kind of proposal? The kind where everyone gets what they actually need, rather than what they think they want. She stood up, somehow managing to keep her teacup perfectly level despite the movement. Human colonies require certain types of worlds for optimal settlement. Rocky planets with manageable gravity, reasonable atmospheric composition, and preferably some distance from anything that explodes regularly. She began pacing slowly around Thrak Voss, who tracked her movement with the wary attention of someone who had recently learned not to underestimate small humans with beverage containers. Vorthan operations, based on what you have described, seem to focus on resource extraction rather than settlement. You need access to mineral deposits, trade routes, and strategic positions. That is correct. Then we have compatible interests rather than conflicting ones. She stopped pacing and fixed him with a direct stare. Humans can provide security for your legitimate mining operations in exchange for fair compensation and formal agreements with the actual owners of those territories. The actual owners. The indigenous populations you mentioned. The ones who were not in a position to make requests because you had established security protocols. Thrak Voss looked distinctly uncomfortable. Some of those populations may no longer be available for negotiations. Emma's expression did not change, but the temperature in the lounge seemed to drop several degrees. Unavailable how? They may have relocated. Voluntarily. Eventually, "Commander," Emma said softly, and her voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made Vex want to find somewhere else to be. "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your operations in those territories. That information is classified." "Not anymore." She tapped her data pad, and a three-dimensional holographic display materialized above the table. "While we have been talking, my colleagues have been conducting their own research into Vorthan activities in the disputed regions." The hologram showed star charts, trade routes, and what appeared to be detailed records of military operations. Vex recognized some of the data formats. They were the kind used by human intelligence services. "How did you?" Thrak Voss began. "Humans are very good at gathering information," Emma said pleasantly. "It is another survival trait we developed on Earth. When everything on your planet is trying to kill you, you learn to pay attention to details." She gestured at the hologram, and it zoomed in on a particular star system. The Kepler 442 system, for example. According to our research, it was inhabited by a species called the Milari until approximately 170 years ago. They were a peaceful, technological civilization with a population of about 12 million. The hologram displayed what appeared to be cities, farmland, and industrial complexes. They were also sitting on one of the largest deposits of rare earth elements in known space, Emma continued, which would have made their territory very valuable to a species engaged in large-scale mining operations. She looked directly at Thrak Voss. "Where are the Milari now, Commander?" "I do not have that information readily available. According to our records, the last verified contact with Milari civilization was 168 years ago. Coincidentally, that was approximately 2 years after Vorthan forces established what you called security protocols in their system." The hologram shifted to show mineral extraction facilities, orbital platforms, and what appeared to be automated mining operations. The Milari cities were systematically dismantled and replaced with industrial infrastructure. The population centers were relocated to what your records describe as resettlement facilities. "Would you like me to show you what happened to those facilities?" Thrak Voss was now visibly sweating, despite the fact that Vorthans were not supposed to be capable of perspiration. "That is ancient history." "It is genocide," Emma said calmly, "and according to Galactic Council Resolution 847 Alpha, genocide is not subject to statute of limitations provisions." The lounge had gone completely silent. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed muted. Furthermore, Emma continued, "Our research indicates that similar patterns occurred in 17 other systems currently claimed by the Vorthan hegemony. In each case, indigenous populations disappeared shortly after Vorthan security forces arrived, and their territories were converted to resource extraction operations." She took another sip of tea, and Vex realized that what he had initially mistaken for casual beverage consumption had actually been a deliberate psychological tactic. Every sip had punctuated another devastating revelation, turning a simple diplomatic gesture into a weapon of suspense. "So," Emma said, setting down her cup with finality, "let me propose a revised negotiation framework, Commander. The Vorthan hegemony will immediately cease all unauthorized operations in territories belonging to other species. They provide full compensation for resources extracted without consent, and submit to Galactic Council oversight of all future expansion activities. And in exchange, humans will not present this evidence to the War Crimes Tribunal, and you will not spend the rest of your natural life in a council detention facility." Thrak Voss stared at the holographic evidence for a long moment. Around him, his soldiers were beginning to regain consciousness, though they seemed remarkably reluctant to move from their positions on the floor. "You planned this," he said finally. "Of course I planned this," Emma replied. "Did you really think we would send a representative to negotiate territorial disputes without researching the other party's history? On Earth, we have a saying, know your enemy, though in this case, I prefer to think of it as know your potential business partner who has some serious legal issues to resolve." The hegemony will never agree to those terms. Emma shrugged. That is entirely their choice. But I should mention that copies of this evidence have already been transmitted to the Galactic Council, the Interspecies Court of Justice, and approximately 200 news organizations across 47 different star systems. Thrak Voss's face went through several color changes that Vex was fairly certain were not supposed to be possible for his species. You cannot do that. This is a diplomatic venue. There are protocols about information security. But actually, said Clix Prime, speaking up for the first time since the incident began. Station regulations clearly state that evidence of war crimes discovered during diplomatic proceedings must be reported to appropriate authorities within 6 hours. The human delegate filed her report approximately 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes ago? Thrak Voss looked confused. But we have been talking for 47 minutes, Emma confirmed. I filed the report while I was disarming your soldiers. Humans are quite good at multitasking. She stood up and smoothed down her jacket with the satisfied air of someone who had just completed a particularly successful business meeting. Now then, Commander, I believe you have some important communications to make with your superiors. I suggest you recommend that they review our proposal carefully. The Galactic Council tends to be much more accommodating when war crimes suspects cooperate voluntarily. Thrak Voss looked around the lounge one more time, taking in the unconscious soldiers, the holographic evidence, and the small human woman who had systematically dismantled his entire strategic position while drinking tea. This is not over, he said finally. Emma smiled. Oh, I rather think it is. But if you would like to schedule another meeting to discuss implementation details, I am available most afternoons. Fair warning, though, next time I might not be feeling quite so diplomatic. She picked up her teacup, drained the last few drops, and set it down with a satisfied sigh. After all, she added conversationally, this was me being polite. As Thrak Voss and his slowly recovering soldiers made their way toward the exit, Vex finally found his voice. That was, he said slowly, the most terrifying display of diplomacy I have ever witnessed. Was it? Emma asked, looking genuinely surprised. I thought it went rather well. Everyone learned something new, nobody died, and we reached a mutually satisfactory resolution. On Earth, we would call that a very successful negotiation. What would you call an unsuccessful negotiation? Emma considered this question with the same serious attention she had given everything else. Well, she said finally, there would probably be significantly more property damage. And I would definitely need more tea. She gathered her belongings with efficient movements, nodded politely to the assembled delegates, and headed toward the exit. Same time next week? She called over her shoulder to Vex. I believe we still need to discuss mining rights in the Centauri system. As the door closed behind her, the lounge remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Torim Kaya spoke up. I think, he said carefully, that humans might be even more dangerous than we thought. Why? Asked Vex. Because that one just conquered an entire star empire using nothing but research logic and a cup of tea. Vex nodded slowly, and she never even raised her voice. Around the lounge, delegates began gathering their belongings with new urgency. Suddenly, everyone seemed to have very important business elsewhere, preferably somewhere that did not involve negotiations with representatives from Class 12 Deathworlds. As for Vex, he made a mental note to update his diplomatic protocols. Clearly, the standard procedures for dealing with humans needed some significant revisions, starting with a recommendation that all future negotiations be conducted via long-range communication from the safety of heavily fortified bunkers, preferably on different planets.